Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the channel. I'm Adam Steele and this is Hot Pole Studios, and today we're going to be doing a tutorial start to finish of how to do mastering on either your own music or someone else's music, specifically using iZotope's Ozone 9. Now, laid out on the laptop in front of me is a track that we're going to use as our example today, and Ozone 9 Advanced. So before we get going, a few things that I want to cover here. Firstly, what is mastering? Let's not take too long on this, but mastering is, or at least should be, the very final stage after a song's been recorded perfectly well, then has been mixed so that the balance of everything is something that the artists and the mix engineer are then happy with. And the final stage is that mastering is only preparing that finished mix for release on its target platform, which is to say, ready for CDs, ready for streaming, ready for vinyl, whatever the target may be. The aim of mastering is to do as little as possible. A lot of people will receive a mix they're not particularly happy with and they'll go, oh, well, it could be fixed in the master. You shouldn't be thinking like that. That's not what mastering is, really. There's the old adage that a great master is made from a great mix, and a great mix is made from great tracking. The old kind of thing of, if you've recorded well, you barely need to mix. If you've mixed well, you barely need to master. That kind of thing. So, with that said, there are many, many ways to do mastering. Most of the time now it's done in the box, it's done digitally. There are still some very high-end mastering engineers who use some outboard analog gear. That's their choice. They get great results out of it. I believe that you can also get great results out of using software such as Ozone. Depending on what the song or album that you're working on needs, it may need more than the tools that Ozone has. But generally speaking, Ozone has been created and developed over the years with the intention of providing most of the tools that you should need and a few extra funky ones. They're usually quite cutting edge when they're made, so there's always something new there for you to try and improve things with. I should quickly note at this point that I have already made this tutorial more or less last year using Ozone 8. So this is an update using Ozone 9, and there will be a few features in there you've not seen before that are now in Ozone 9 standard that weren't in Ozone 8 standard. But generally speaking, if you've seen the tutorial I've already done, this will be largely the same. Now, this track in front of us, and I'm going to cut to the screen here, this is a song by a young band called The Cavs. They're kind of an indie rock band. They're from Manchester in England, as are a couple of well-known bands in this genre who sound quite like this. This song, this is the mix that I created about a week ago. Quite often with a band like this, I'll be working on trying to achieve a master at the same time as doing the mix, which is definitely not recommended at first. It's something that I now do to get a clearer picture of where I'm headed with the mix, but that's definitely kind of mixing your different disciplines and is something that I wouldn't really recommend until you've got a firm grasp on tracking, mixing and mastering. So that's why I've gone back in this case to just having a mix with no master work on it. As you can see just from looking at the WAV file, I'm going to move Ozone for a minute. There are no clips anywhere. The volume is quite loud, but there are no zeros, no overs at any point, which is a definite thing that you should do. If you're going to be a mastering engineer and you're going to be sent a mix, request that the mix is not slammed, that the volume is not above 0, that there's no limiting going on, because that's something that, if there is any limiting needs doing, that the mastering engineer should be doing at the very last possible stage. Now, I'm going to put on these headphones so that I can hear exactly what's going on in this master. Usually I would suggest monitoring on the best studio monitors you have available, like this situation behind me right here. The reason I'm putting the headphones on is for the purposes of this tutorial video, so that it doesn't then bleed all over the microphones here. So this is a purely practical thing. Usually I would listen on these. If I was to hit play on this track, we'll see what's happening. Cool. And by default, Ozone 9 comes up with its equalizer doing nothing, and its maximizer with a threshold of -2, just boosting the overall level by 2 decibels and doing nothing else. This is great. This means that apart from that little 2 dB level bump there, this is a nice clean slate. This is an easy place to start from. And the first place that I tend to go when I'm working with mastering is I generally tend to sort out the overall volume level. That is to say, I either do some limiting or at least approach a limiter. Why do I do that? Most of the tracks that we're going to be comparing our song to, and we'll really get to talking about referencing in a minute, are already quite loud, especially when it comes to streaming and especially CDs. Even though CDs are less and less popular now and streaming has become the thing, having songs that are quieter than everybody else's, definitely not a good thing, but at the same time, we don't want to absolutely kill it. A lot of the streaming platforms now use a target, which we'll go on to explain later, which is -14 LUFS. Now, at the bottom left of this maximizer, there is a learn threshold button with a target already set at -14 LUFS. So if I hit play by ticking the learn threshold button and listen to the track for a second, this might get a bit loud. So if I hit untick there, I can see that my threshold has now gone down to -4.9 decibels. Now, one thing I want to change is I want to change this ceiling. The ceiling says 0.0 dB, and what that means is that any limiting that does happen is going to happen right at the top. And that can be a problem, because that means that if that happens, that can actually cause distortion when it's played back. So on a CD, I'd bring that ceiling down to 0.3 dB, and for streaming, we really have to bring that ceiling down to -1, because that's what a lot of the streaming services insist upon. If you give them any louder than that, they can quite outright reject it. So definitely do that. The next thing we'll want to do, if we're looking at limiting, is change the limiting algorithm, which is the part on the side of the maximizer. I tend to use IRC4 because that's the most recent and therefore the most advanced, clearest, punchiest, least distorted type of limiter that iZotope have. And that's always going to be a good thing, because that means that if we start to push the level any further, and we might well do that later on, then that means that it's going to stay cleaner and clearer for longer. From here, generally speaking, my next step on a master is almost always to have some sort of super duper low cut. That is to say, if I go to the equalizer and touch band 1, change it to be a high pass brick wall, and then bring the frequency way down to something like 30 hertz or so, that does then mean that any ultra low sub stuff, and I'm not talking speaker rattling stuff, I'm talking speaker breaking stuff, bad stuff, that can all just be got rid of. That's now gone. which means that we can still get some really low sub stuff if we want to, depending on your genre. That's usually from 30 something hertz up to about 60, 80 hertz. That's the super low stuff. That's the stuff that gets your car bouncing. That's the stuff that makes hi-fis give you that real kind of low gut punch. Anything below that is just not going to do anything apart from break your speakers and cloud up the mix potentially, where it's taking up extra volume that you could be using for the rest of the track. Up till this point, these have been mastering moves that I would generally do on just about everything. From here, it really depends what genre you're working with and who you want the artist that you're working with to sound like. And I don't mean be a carbon copy of. I mean sound like in terms of how much volume do we have? How much mids do we have? How much bass and treble does our mix have compared to stuff that's on the radio or at the top of the SoundCloud playlist charts right now, or whatever's trending, if that's your aim, or something that you like if trending isn't your aim. You want to be comparative to that in terms of the technical side. That is to say, the amount of level, the amount of stereo width, the amount of amounts of things. Completely divorcing ourselves from the creative side for a minute here. That's a big thing with mastering, really. We want to be doing as little creatively as possible. We just want this finished mix to then fill the shoes of the target that it's heading towards. It's a difficult balance, and that's why mastering has always been seen as one of these kind of dark arts and very hard to explain kind of things, because how do you do all these EQ moves and all these compressions and all this kind of stuff without making it sound any different? That's the idea anyway. That's the whole thing about mastering, is it should sound exactly like it sounded before, but better. And that can be quite a difficult thing to do. So that's what we're going to do here, and we're going to use a reference. Now, at the bottom right of Ozone 9, there is now a button for reference. So if we click plus for add reference, we can add a song. Preferably not something that's MP3, but I was asked by the band to use a Muse song. Now, which one was it? You know what, let's use Uprising by Muse. Now, I'm not going to play this on the YouTube video because it will very definitely get me a copyright strike. Don't really want that. But if you look at the way this is imported, it shows different sections. We've got A sections, B sections, C sections. It can actually hear the difference between a verse sound and a chorus sound. Very clever. So what we can do is we can click on a certain section and it will loop that section over and over and over. If I hit play, we'll still hear our original track, but if I hit this little on-off button next to reference, that will switch to the Muse song. So if I do that. Okay, so now that I've played that little bit for me that you can't hear, we've at least got a reference in here that we can keep flicking backwards and forwards from. So we will come back to the volume maximizer at the end. I can hear that our song isn't as loud as the Muse song, but they're not that far away from each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that for now. We're going to go and work on the rest of the notes that I've got, then come back at the end to see if there's still some volume adjustment that needs doing. So the first thing that I noticed was that our relative amount of low end could do with coming up compared to our reference. So that's our EQ. That's only a couple of decibels in the equalizer. You can move these points up and down, and these little dots mean you can make it more broad or more specific. A mastering EQ is much more gentle than your normal EQ. If I do a big spike there, that's -7 decibels. On a normal kind of conventional EQ, that might be 20 dB, which would be absolutely ridiculous. I mean, not that you'd want to do such a big notch in a mastering context. If you're doing that in a mastering context and doing 6 or 7 dB, either you've been sent a mix that really needed some work, or you're working on something that you literally only have the one copy of that you'll never have anything else to work from again. For example, an old like reel-to-reel tape recording from the 50s or 60s or something like that. That's quite often something that mastering engineers end up working quite hard on. So we've got a bit of an EQ, we've got our maximizer. This is where this plus button comes in, because if I click that, that drops down our list of all our options. A couple of these are for the advanced version only, like the low-end focus, master rebalance, and the spectral shaper. But the rest of them should be available to us. And we can add as many of these modules in a row as we like. And it goes left to right, so the order of modules can be quite important. What I'm going to do is add a stereo imager here, and then I'm going to move that to the left of the maximizer, because the maximizer really should be the very last module in the chain. If that's the very last thing, and that makes things nice and loud and clean, we're not then distorting anything that comes afterwards, because nothing should come afterwards. It's a good way to work it out. So the imager, if I just get a slider here, I've got a single one, that's going to take the entire mix from mono at -100 to completely just far too ridiculously stereo and will sound awful. What we really want to do is pull up one of these little presets here. Let's start with modern width. Now that modern width preset, I'm not much of a presets guy, but this has really cut a lot of time out in setting this up for us. This has brought up 4 bands of stereo widening. Now the bass, the really low bass, has actually been made a little bit more mono with this slider. The low mids haven't been touched. Everything kind of in the vocal range and the guitar range is just a tiny bit wider. And everything that's up top, really high, like the cymbals and that kind of thing, is just that little bit more extra wide. I'm going to play this back on and off. Cool, so suddenly everything just pops a little more without sounding ridiculous and without sounding forced. It can be quite easy to overdo stereo imaging and end up making things just not translate well outside of the exact system that you're listening on, so do be very careful of that. At this point, we can talk about the modules that are new in Ozone 9 standard that were only in Ozone 8 advanced previously, and that's the vintage modules. We've got the vintage EQ, which is one of my favourites, and we'll talk about that now because that's got a very scary looking set of controls, but it's actually not too bad. You've got to be very gentle with it, but it's got low boost, which you can see does a big kind of lump. Then we've got low cut, which does exactly what it says. High boost, high cut, and then there's the mids at the bottom. Now this works like a Pultec EQ, a passive EQ. It's very broad, very musical, very generous, and you can use tiny little bits of boost and of cut all at the same time, and that'll do subtle changes. And the boost and cut, they're not in exactly the same frequency, so they just gently make things sound fatter or thicker or more present at the top without sounding overly harsh. So let's hit play and play with the low end a little bit. I'm going to go back to equalizer 1 and turn off that bump there. Cool, so I've just done a nice big round low boost, but then cut, which actually affects the low mids a little bit. And then I've done quite a big 12k high boost for that modern air thing, but then cut some above 10k, which gives us a very gentle slope so we don't get an ear-splitting top end. I'm going to try the on and off button for this module here just to see how it sounds without. Cool. So what I've done there with the mids is I've just boosted the 500 Hz range a bit, which with the passive EQ is much nicer than doing it with an active digital EQ where you would just get a very boxy sound. I've cut a tiny bit there at 1.5k and I've done a little boost at 3k, and these are all very gentle. You can see this slope looks far more gentle than it would do if it was with one of these equalizers. And let's hear the difference now between that. Of course, I am exaggerating a little here by dragging these up and down further than I normally would, but that's almost for the purposes of the camera, just so that you can hear what I'm doing. The vintage tape's also a family favourite. I can get a nice 15-inch tape, which is one of the industry standards. 30 inches per second was kind of the later standard, which is technically cleaner and actually sounds less tape-like, arguably. So if we drive that a little bit, add some harmonics, that should just give us a nice roundness. And that's starting to sound nice and sweet. If we add in the vintage limiter, there's also the vintage compressor, but just for today we'll just use the vintage limiter in tube mode and just... Looks like in this case the vintage limiter, unless we were to really kill it, isn't doing very much. So in that case, and this is a good mastering tip, if you don't need it, leave it out. That's what we're going to do. Let's look at the vintage compressor in here, make sure that's got some sort of preset that does something. Let's have a listen and see what this does. Cool, so the vintage compressor there seems to be just keeping the overall level of that kick drum much more smooth with the rest of the track. And that's the kind of thing that a digital compressor could do, but would just have quite a different sound to it. So that's where the dynamics module would usually come in, but we already have that. So if we looked at the dynamic EQ just before the maximizer, this is something where we can click the Tighten Dynamics and just watch this and see if any stray parts here get caught by the dynamic EQ. In fact, have we got anything? Yeah, smooth high end. This seems more useful to us. Because what this will do is the dynamic EQ won't do anything to the mix at all unless there's too much of a certain frequency, and then it'll just pull it down gently. That's nice. That's just becoming a subtle de-esser because it's got a 2.5K dip and a very broad 12K dip. So if there's too much in any of those frequencies, it's just very subtly, just for that split second, taking it out, and it's not a compressor. So we're not hearing a release curve anywhere. And very finally, we can push the threshold down on this a little bit to get a little louder than -14. I know that that's what Spotify and I think now YouTube have their loudness normalization at -14. If we push it a little harder, just to get a little bit of life out of this limiter, that means that any streaming services that allow it to be a little louder will then accommodate that. But at the same time, we're not going so loud that we're crushing things against the limiter and really making the sound suffer. So let's just listen to this. Well, that's really quite satisfying to see that the meters here were going for, the output was at RMS -12. Which means that that's a little bit louder than the target of -14, but the only thing that was being dipped there was the transients on the snare, which, to a point, I don't mind. Especially for a rock track, I don't want the transients to be too much on the snare. I want it to hit, but I want it to be fat. And to be fat, you don't need that much extra transient. So, if I reference that against our Muse song, which again, apologies, I'm not going to be able to do on stream. Okay, so the Muse track is significantly louder, but otherwise is in the right ballpark. And now we're sounding a lot more like the Muse song. We can actually do one more thing, which is match EQ at this point, just to see how different they are. Yes, I know that now we're hitting -9 RMS, which is relatively destructive, but at the same time, that's a choice we can make, and when we come to streaming, we can just back that off a bit, because when Muse released the song that I'm comparing this to, the loudness was, which is how loud you could get meant how good you sounded, was very much in full effect, whereas now with streaming being dominant, and with this whole volume limiting per track thing being the standard rather than being some weird esoteric thing, that fight is essentially over, which means that I can later on go and back this volume off and not really see any penalty. But last thing then, so match EQ. This is a module that's been around for a while, tucked away inside the normal equalizer. So what we're going to do is we're going to put that at the very start, and what we're going to do, this is a little annoying that you can't just drop a reference in here, but I'm going to insert in our Reaper project here, which you can be using any DAW of choice, but I'm just going to go in and find the exact song that we've been using. Yes, this is an MP3. Again, definitely use WAV files or FLACs. And yeah, this is, again, just for the cameras. If I'm going to be using a song, I definitely always find it on somewhere like hdtracks.com, or if I've got the CD, I'll rip the CD and use the WAV file. But now, I've put this match EQ right at the beginning of our chain to capture this Muse song, to capture its tonal balance. So if I hit the reference capture button here, and press play, this is going to be muted for you for a few seconds because, again, I don't want to get in trouble for copyright. Okay, so that can now go. The match EQ module can go much nearer to the end, but before the maximizer. And now let's get to a lively bit of our track and hit the capture button in the apply to. Okay, and so they are done. And you see this white line here with very, very little on it actually. There's barely a decibel there, and that's because we've been referencing quite a lot. We've been listening back to that reference Muse song as we've gone and used our ears to go more bass, more mids, less of this, more of this. But there is a very, very subtle amount here, and I can turn the amount up and it will get absolutely crazy. If I turn the smoothing off, that is absolutely crazy. But if I was to keep that smooth, because otherwise that it becomes too detailed an EQ, I could have just a decibel or two here at 7k, a bit less at 120 hertz. And that could well be the absolute final polish on our track. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a quick walkthrough of mastering in a nutshell. It should be, and I've tried to use every trick here. If you don't need to use any of these particular modules, don't use them. If you do need to quite heavily use all of these modules, maybe listen to the mix and then refer back to the mix, send it back to the mix engineer and go, I've noticed these things, can you change this? I tend to find that's far more effective. If you're doing mastering and you're working with a mix engineer, if you're given a reference and the original track is nothing like it tonally, tell the mixer. It could well be that their mixing system is compromised. Part of your job as a mastering engineer is to try and be impartial, take a couple of references, or in some mastering engineers' case, just their gut instinct, and compare the mix they've been given to that and bring it up to that level. And if that's not possible, at least go back to the mix engineer and say why. Now, I know this has been quite a kind of long route around mastering where I could have just gone, this module does this module does that, but mastering in itself is all about philosophy, so I just wanted to make sure that you all knew why you were doing what you were doing. So hopefully this really helps you in your mastering journey, and if it has, then thank you for watching, and maybe consider subscribing to the channel, and maybe help us out on Patreon, because that helps us to do more videos like this. And we do gear reviews on microphones, on preamps, on interfaces, on all sorts of gear. We look at different guitar speakers, different drum heads, all sorts of stuff to do with recording and getting the best sounds from recording all the way through to the final master. And we do some really advanced niche stuff as well as this slightly more basic tutorial. So if you're interested in unlocking the secrets of the audio world, then stick around, check us out. I'm Adam Steele and this is Hot Pole Studios. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next video.